I'm not as young as I used to be, which means I can't treat my body the way I once did. In fact, last year's medical checkup didn't turn out the best, so I decided I needed to change things up and start eating healthier. One of the ways I do that is by making smoothies. But smoothie shop prices can be pretty high, and making them at home always seem like a pain. You gotta pull the blender out, find the right attachments, set everything up, and then cleaning everything is annoying, making it difficult to quickly whip up a breakfast smoothie in the morning. That's why I'm glad to tell you about the BlendJet 2 portable blender. Like I said, it's portable, so you can blend up a smoothie at work, a protein shake at the gym, or even a margarita on the beach. It's small enough to fit in a cup holder, but powerful enough to blast through tough ingredients like ice and frozen fruit with ease. BlendJet 2 is whisper quiet, so you can make your morning smoothie without waking up the whole house. That's especially important to me because I wake up before the rest of my family, and once my kids are up, my morning work routine is pretty much shot to hell. And best of all, BlendJet 2 cleans itself. Just blend water with a drop of soap and you're good to go. BlendJet 2 has over 30 plus colors and patterns to choose from, so if you don't like one design, there's definitely one that suits your personality. So what are you waiting for? Go to blendjet.com and grab yours today. Be sure to use my promo code SuperCinemaPod12 to get 12% off your order and free 2-day shipping. No other portable blender on the market comes close to the quality, power, and innovation of the BlendJet 2. They guarantee you'll love it or your money back. Blend anytime, anywhere with the BlendJet 2 portable blender. Go to blendjet.com and use my code SuperCinemaPod12. That's SuperCinemaPod and the numbers 12 to get 12% off your order and free 2-day shipping. Shop today and get the best deal ever.
With your hands bound, I just want to talk.
Last time we talked, I ended up hanging from my ankles.
That was before I knew who you were. Before I knew what made you different from the others. I have an audio recording from Pegasus of your voice from a plane crash 6 years ago on a device I believe you call a black box.
They told me it was destroyed in the crash. How'd you get it?
She don't understand. Young lady, I have a special skill that kind of allows me to get into places I'm not supposed to be.
Call me young lady again, I'm gonna put my foot in a place it's not supposed to be.
Am I supposed to guess where that is?
Your ass.
Oh. Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and joining me is a new guest and a fellow podcaster, and that is Nicholas Pepin. Nick, how you doing today?
I'm good. How about you?
Doing pretty good. Just finished wrapping up another episode right before, so I'm doing a double feature this morning. Before we jump too much into today's movie, we're going to be talking about Captain Marvel. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and about your podcast?
I live in Wisconsin, right outside of Milwaukee. I have a podcast called Pop Culture Roulette I do with two of my friends, where we basically anything we want to talk about, we just call it pop culture and talk about it. It's real convenient to basically like, hey, if we feel like talking about sports today, well, sports is pop culture. If we feel like talking about the newest movie or whatever, obviously that's pop culture. But currently we're in the middle of a series on who played it best. We just released the episode for the others. So like everybody who's not Marvel or DC. So like everybody who played Green Hornet, Flash Gordon, the Archie comics, whatever. And we were debating who did what, what was the better live action actor. We've got Marvel on deck, and then we're going to attempt to crack DC, but that's a large
there, yeah. Especially when you get into Batman and Superman, you got so many options there.
Yeah, that's why I had to limit it to live action, because like we were gonna have to do an episode just on Batman if we did animated as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, even just live action, you could just do an episode on Batman because there have been so damn many of them.
I mean, there's I think 8 live action Batman,
something like that.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned this because I just before I started recording stuff today, I watched the new trailer for The Flash, and Michael Keaton gets a lot more chance to shine in that trailer, and God, he looks so good in this movie. And as much as I hate Ezra Miller, I can't turn down the chance to watch Michael Keaton on the big screen one last time.
No, I was there in '89. I distinctly remember going to see that movie in the theaters. I received that as a I can't remember if it was a birthday gift or a Christmas gift, but I had that the black and yellow cassette tape that just had like the Batman logo on it,
Yeah, I had that too.
the VHS. That is, as much as I love, a lot of the other Batman stuff, like Michael Keaton is my Batman.
Yeah, yeah. No, I feel a
So
lot of yeah. I mean, like there's stuff I quibble with in terms of the whole killing aspect of it, but still, like just his performance. The more I think about it, the more I'm just like that is my Batman. You're right.
yeah, and like DC has been disappointing, to put it mildly, the last handful of films that they've
Hmm.
released. And so like with the first trailer, I was like, oh man, it's got Michael Keaton, so I'm gonna see it. And then the one, like you said, I watched it while I was getting ready for this as well, and I was like, oh, he is like. This is why they're actually releasing the movie, because they spent way too much time and effort getting Michael Keaton in this thing.
I'm still holding out hope they that we might be able to see him in a Batman Beyond movie because he looks so much like the part now for an old Bruce Wayne.
Absolutely. And I don't believe for a second that someday they won't figure out a way to accidentally release Batgirl.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
I'm hoping about that too. That's one of my hopes too. But anyway, so obviously you talked about '89 Batman, seeing that when you were young. So because we talk about superheroes here, what was kind of like your gateway into superhero stuff?
I mean, Batman would be the easiest answer. I grew up in a town right outside of Memphis that the library actually had comic books. So like my parents, particularly my mom, would take us to the library, and we just free run of the library, and I'd go read the Batman. They had Batman comics, but they had Fantastic Four and the Avengers and stuff like that. And then a good friend of mine had Daredevil, and Daredevil and Punisher. So like my interest in comic books has been around for as long as I can remember. I've proudly been a nerd my entire life.
Mhm.
Like this whole nerd renaissance where we now run the world is great, but I've been
Yeah.
here forever. Like
Yeah, well, we're talking about Captain Marvel, so this will probably definitely factor in the conversation about like all the misogynistic discussions going on. And like me growing up as a lonely kid who was like the only one in my school who liked comic books, or at least the only one who was willing to admit that they like comic books, I would have killed for people to be interested in this stuff back when I was growing up.
right, I would have killed for just having podcast didn't exist back then. I would have
Mhm.
killed just for the idea of being able to sit down and have a conversation with people, or listen to two people have a conversation about the stuff that I was interested in. And I mean, just the internet obviously also didn't exist then, so it was
Mhm.
harder to find people who were willing to have those conversations.
Right, right, yeah. I mean, I think you said you saw Batman in the theater, so I think you're a little bit older than me. But yeah, I remember we got the internet in my house when I was like in probably like eighth grade or something like that. So it was like right at the end of junior high, and that was when I was able to first find out. It's like, oh wow, other people like comic books too. And it was like
Yeah, I
it was a huge revelation to me because like nobody in my town had ever talked about it.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in high school, because I graduated high school in '96, so I think based on, because I did listen to a couple episodes, so I knew what I was getting into. I think I've got 4 or 5 years on you.
Yeah, I graduated
Um,
in '02, so
yeah, so I remember like people, like there was the early days of the internet where like you had basically just chat rooms,
chat
but
rooms,
like
AOL message boards was a big thing in my
yeah,
yeah.
I mean that kind of, and then when I graduated high school and went to college, like my college was just starting to get in on the internet. Like they didn't even have like official email. Like they just had like a computer room where you could go do research for your papers and stuff. But like
Hmm.
you didn't know, almost nobody had a computer in their dorm room
Right.
that was internet capable. It was basically just there to write term papers.
Yeah. Um, okay. And another thing I want to ask people lately is, what are you interested in right now? Like it can be anything, comics, movies, TV shows, video games. What is kind of grabbing your interest at the moment?
Um, I mean, I'm still very much interested in whatever Marvel is. I've just been so entrenched in doing the podcast thing. A friend of mine from college started an '80s podcast where he talks about '80s films. So I've been rewatching a bunch of '80s films, but I also have been rewatching the Monsters, from the
Oh, okay.
'60s. But I just last weekend I watched Cocaine Bear,
Oh,
which
how was
if you
that?
oh, it is gloriously cheesy. It is. I mean, don't you're not getting well, Citizen Kane is always the example that people use, but I've never actually watched that movie. You're not getting a masterpiece. You
Mm.
are getting something similar to Snakes on a Plane. So it is everybody in it knew what they were getting into, and they just had fun with it. It is a sci-fi, like it's a movie that got elevated beyond just a sci-fi original. It is so much fun, and it is just cheesy. Um,
And
I just
Elizabeth Banks is in that too, isn't she?
She directed it.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, she isn't
Um,
in it, but she directed it.
oh, okay. Because I was thinking to because we had just done an episode on the 2017 Power Rangers where she gloriously chews all the scenery in that movie, and I was hoping she was in it too. Maybe we get to see some more scenery chewing performances from her, but I guess not.
No, but she allowed some people. She allowed who was trying to remember now. I'm blanking on who. Felicity.
Oh, Carrie. I can't remember her last name, but yeah, I know who you're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. They allowed her to do some scenery chewing, and then
Okay.
the one of the Jesse Tyler Ferguson from Modern Family,
Hmm.
for his very short in the movie, he got to do some scenery. I mean, it was like I said, it is absolutely cheesy. I love bad movies. I love good movies, but I mean, right, like it just finished its run a couple months ago, and I'm waiting for the new season of What We Do in the Shadows.
Hmm.
That might be one of my favorite shows on TV right now.
Okay, cool.
So,
Very cool. For my part, like I've been recording so many of these episodes in a row lately, so I've been trying to pick something different each episode, so I don't bore the audience by mentioning the same thing. But one thing is, I'm going to be appearing on my buddy's Power Rangers podcast soon, and we're going to be talking about the original Japanese version of Power Rangers, Kyoryu Sentai Zoo Ranger. So. I've been watching some of those episodes. I'm not sure if you ever were a Power Rangers guy back in the day, but it's really fun going back and watching the original Japanese because there's some things about it that's so similar. Obviously, they use the same action footage for a lot of the stuff, but also like just to see like the different ways that they told the same story with these footage is also a really interesting thing to do.
because
And
you currently live in Japan, right?
yes, yeah.
Okay, so I'm guessing that means you are fluent in Japanese.
Not fluent, no. I mean, I after being here for 10 plus years, I should be, but but I'm not, unfortunately. But it is cool to watch it too because I understand a lot more of the cultural stuff than I would have if I'd never been in Japan. So that's also an interesting aspect to watching this show. And
Yeah,
it's
the Power Rangers were a little after me. Like I was towards the end of high school when that started. So like I was aware of it, and I
mhm,
think I probably watched a little bit of it here and there, but it was a little bit out of my wheelhouse by the time it came out. I mean, I've been aware of it, and I have no problems with it. It's not like I'm
mhm.
anti Power Ranger, but I've always just seen it as more of a Voltron ripoff, and well, Voltron is what I had when I was a kid.
Right,
So
right. Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarities to that. I'm not sure which came first. Was it Sentai or Voltron? I'd have to look that up in Japan. But yeah, actually, the first time I had encountered something Voltron was my first thought was like, oh, is this a Power Rangers animated thing? um, but yeah, and even when Power Rangers came out, I was about 10 years old when it came out, and at that point in my school, it was uncool to like Power Rangers. So I was like, it was like my secret shame back then when I was in elementary
Oh,
school.
see, that's sad. I'm so glad that kids these days don't have, well, hopefully don't have
Hmm.
the same problems that we had.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, today we are discussing, like we mentioned, Captain Marvel, first movie starring Brie Larson as Carol Danvers. What's your history with Carol in the comics? Have you ever had much exposure to her in the
When
comic books, or were you can't do you come in with this movie?
No, I was reading her when she was Miss Marvel.
Hmm.
Before they did the switch to Captain Marvel in what was that, like 08, 09,
Yeah, that
somewhere
was,
in.
yeah.
Yeah. I was a fan of her then. So like I was, I mean, I do, I don't know as much about the character as somebody like, I did some research a little bit here and there, and I have in '05 when I moved from Florida to Wisconsin, I got back into comic books in a big way, and like I
Mhm.
started going to a store and buying and the Captain Marvel character while she was grounded on. But yeah, no, I've always, like I've enjoyed her as a character. I enjoy whenever they put her in a video game. I tend to use her like when they did her in Marvel Ultimate Alliance or Ultimate Alliance 2, whichever one she appeared in.
Yeah, I think that was Ultimate Alliance 2, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So like I was definitely aware of the character and had a passing familiarity with it before the movie came out.
Mhm. I had known her from like I'd seen her in the she appeared in one episode of the X-Men animated series. So that was probably my first exposure to her. So I knew mostly about her through the X-Men, and like that's how Rogue got her flight and her super strength and all those powers. But when I started reading the Avengers when Kurt Busiek and George Perez were doing their run in the late '90s, and she was a member, and she ended up joining the team, and that was my big exposure to Carol as a character. Back then, she was called Warbird, but she was still wearing the Ms. Marvel costume. And yeah, I really liked her in that run, and I became a fan of her at that point. And so when they brought her back as Ms. Marvel, I'd read those books after the fact, and but then when they brought her back, when they gave her the Captain Marvel mantle, I thought, oh yeah, this actually makes a whole lot of sense. So I was totally on board for that. I've only read some of the books with her. I've only read some of her solo books as Captain Marvel. I've read her mostly in team books since then, like when she pops up in the Avengers and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, I've always just, I remember she was binary at one point too, wasn't she?
Yeah, that was in the after she had because after the thing with Rogue, she had lost her powers, and then she had joined the X-Men for a time, just kind of like helping them out. And then they went into space, and this was in probably the 1980s, I believe. She gained like these new space powers as binary, and then those powers pretty much they've been the same powers. It's just now she doesn't transform into the binary form, but like the energy manipulation, the flight, all of that, it still comes from the binary powers. Like they haven't gone back. They've kind of like retroactively given her the super strength and stuff as well, I think, but mostly it comes from the binary powers.
Okay. Yeah.
So what did you think about this movie when you first watched it? Because this was actually it took a while to get this. They were actually originally planning to introduce Captain Marvel in Age of Ultron, was what Josh Whedon wanted to do, but that plan had been scrapped, and then production for this movie just kept getting pushed back, pushed back, pushed back until finally they ended up doing it, right after Infinity War. But what do you think at the time when you first saw it?
I mean, I really enjoyed the movie the first time I saw it. I do think that the introduction was a little weird. Because I mean, as a comic book nerd, like when I take my wife to see these movies, she hadn't watched any of those before we got married. We've been married now for about 12 years, so
Mhm.
like I've been introduced. She doesn't want to read any of it. She just wants to watch the movies. She doesn't want to hear about it when we're out because then I'll be like, oh, they changed this or they did that, or and she's like, whatever. I just, I want to enjoy the movie. So at the end of Infinity War, when we got the Captain Marvel symbol, and knowing that movie was coming, I was like, oh, I'm so excited for like what that meant. I enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought Brie Larson did a better than good job at it. Having rewatched it, I see some problems, but nothing that wouldn't put it, squarely middle to upper end of the pack of the Marvel movies. I mean, I know a lot of people hate it, and I'm sure we'll get there, but
Mhm. Yeah, this movie got tons of unjustified hate, I'd say, because I really enjoyed it too. Like you said, there's some issues. I think the whole idea of setting it in the 90s and having such this big, sci-fi type thing in a time before Iron Man was supposed to kickstart this whole idea of like sci-fi superheroes in the MCU feels a little incongruous. I mean, I think they managed to. mostly they managed to stick the landing, but it still feels a little odd to think about this as being in the MCU past. Because just like that whole space battle, it feels like somebody would have noticed something like that going on.
Well, and the one thing that my wife asked me and is that like during the Battle of Manhattan or during Ultron, like Fury never thought, hey, maybe I should use the pager for this. Like, so I did hear somebody, and I don't remember who it was, whether it was one of the Russos or Brie Larson herself, was like, why didn't Fury ever use the pager? And they were like, well, who said that he didn't?
Mm-hmm.
And she just either refused to answer or was like, that's not big enough for me to come bother with.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about that too, and I agree. I think your wife makes a really good point, and I don't think there's my headcanon of trying to resolve that was just that, well, Fury had the Avengers. He probably didn't think it was a big enough concern to summon Captain Marvel for that, which is, it's iffy. It's definitely an iffy explanation, but it's kind of like the timeline here. It kind of works. It mostly works. It's not perfectly, but it mostly works if you think about it that way.
No, and I agree with you that the hate is completely unjustified, and I think most of the hate comes from the troll forums.
Yes, yeah.
I think the people who actually watched the movie either were like, well, it's not bad, or quite enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can pick apart some scenes that didn't work or just kind of were a little bit cheesy, but overall, I think the tone of the movie worked. Setting it in the 90s does create some timeline problems because then you're like, wait, how did nobody notice what was happening over here? Especially somebody like Tony Stark.
Mm-hmm.
You know? But I mean that is the problem with all the solo Marvel movies after you've had the Avengers.
Yeah.
Is that you now have a world where like Iron Man could call any of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't. Like, or any of these people could look at the TV and say, hey, wait, Spider-Man is over here fighting massive people on the Statue of Liberty. I think he's got it. We'll just hang out and we'll just watch.
Yeah, I remember, and I kind of reconcile that away the same way I do when that happens in comic books. It's just you assume, okay, well, they're off on another adventure somewhere else. But there are definitely times when it feels like someone else should have gotten involved here. Like, I love Winter Soldier, but the whole thing about bringing down S.H.I.E.L.D., that feels like it's a time to at least give Tony Stark a call, see what he's up to, maybe.
Right, yeah. No, he didn't think, hey, maybe I should go check out what's going on over here. I mean, surely the news had to cover it,
Mm-hmm.
Helicarriers are crashing, that feels like something that would make headline news that night,
Yeah. But also, too, the past thing, too, I think it works with certain things. I thought Ant-Man worked really well when they had revealed that Hank and Jan were operating in the past because, they're operating as covert agents, basically. They can shrink down. It makes sense why nobody would be able to see them. It's
right.
A lot harder to buy that when it's spaceships blowing up with right in front of the moon.
Right, yeah. And, and then, you would think also as, I was just trying to watch it again because I like to try to watch everything twice before I do it. And, she's chasing these aliens down on a train in the middle of Los Angeles. And like that, you feel like that's a story that makes the news or like, the tabloid is like, oh, these alien, like, there's
Right.
gotta be stories. So I would love to see, like maybe like a damage control series or some sort of, series that's either going through and covering that stuff up, kind of like a Marvel X-Files.
Mm-hmm.
Where or the on the other side of it, the group of people who are like trying to uncover all the secrets because they're like, you've got to believe like this is really happening. Like,
well, I think actually that's what Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. should have been. I think
and
that would be a much better way to handle that approach.
And I do think that if Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was to happen now instead of prior to the Fox acquisition when they could use the word mutant, we would have gotten a very different show.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And also, they would,
if Kevin Feige was in charge of it instead of Ike Perlmutter, too.
Right, and they probably wouldn't have destroyed the Inhuman thing, but But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed Agents of Shield up until like the last season or two when it got
Mhm,
weird and time travel-y. But
mhm. I haven't seen actually the last 2 seasons of it, and for the most part, I liked it more than I didn't like it, but I also felt like it could have been so much better than what we got. And I
yeah,
think if you had done something like exploring, I think when it was at its best was probably season 2, right before the Inhuman stuff started up. That was probably for me the end of season 1, beginning of season 2 was probably like my peak time for Agents of Shield.
well, Agents of Shield when it led right in directly into Age of Ultron,
Mm-hmm.
and then when Winter Soldier happened and Dark World happened, like it
Yeah,
was actually involved in the show. And then at some point they were like, we're not going to be involved with the movie people anymore. We're going to
I
go
think
off and do our own thing.
I think that was when that was around the time because after Age of Ultron was when Feige threatened to quit because Perlmutter was trying to push him out, and then that's when Disney moved Marvel Studios into its own branch, and then Marvel TV stayed under Ike Perlmutter. So I think that's when that shift happened.
Yeah. So yeah, but I mean overall, up until I think about the point that you were pointing out, it was an enjoyable show. But
Mm-hmm.
I to try to steer it back into Captain Marvel, I guess. But it does raise timeline questions, but I think I know a lot of the complaints about Phase 4, the one that we just ended or
Mm-hmm.
currently in. I'm never really sure
I think it
that
just ended with Quantum Mania, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah. Like the complaint is like it seems all over the place and it's not connected like it was in 1 and 2 and 3. But it's like I think we don't know what's
Mm-hmm.
going on. I think that we might get a movie that goes back and connects things and puts some stuff behind the scenes that we didn't know about. Kind of like when Ant Man brought Hank Pym in, and we're like, well, Hank Pym was there. He was
Mm-hmm.
there at the beginning of Shield. He just got mad and he left, but that's why Shield had stuff that they had. That's
Right.
where
No,
So
I
I'm
agree, and
I'm
and and this one does that, fills in some of those gaps too, like with the Tesseract, right? Like what happened to
right.
it in all that time? It was just sitting in a box somewhere, but no, we find out that no, they were trying to do stuff. Marvel was trying to do experiments with it and everything, so that filled in some of those gaps here too. Um, I think the timeline. I think is one of the biggest things. I'm fine with the parts of this being set in the '90s, but I think I would have moved a lot of the action set pieces, which is why I think maybe you come out with this before Infinity War or something like that, and maybe have some of those action set pieces in the present day or at least in a post Avengers realm or something like that to have it fit together a little bit more. I don't know. I'd have to even that as I'm saying it maybe doesn't sound exactly right either, but
No, I'm with you on that, and then the one running joke of the movie that was kind of like a hot tub time machine. Like when's it gonna happen? Like when's the eye patch coming? You
mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah,
like that constant joke, or the Stan Lee Kevin Smith cameo.
the
But I
Mallrats
mean, I
cameo.
guess yeah, like as a big time Kevin Smith nerd, as a big time Kevin Smith fan, like I was super excited to see that, and I'm just like, where are we? That opens the door to maybe bring him in at some point, which I know he's been resistant to, but
Yeah, I mean, I loved all that part. Um, so let's talk. So you mentioned Brie Larson. Like I thought she also did a great job in this. I mean, a lot of people they are saying like her performance is too wooden, and I'm kind of wondering if we watch the same movie because I don't get that at all from her. There are obviously parts where she's playing it very straight, but like her interactions with Fury, she's a joy to watch in those. Like she's
right,
just
yeah,
she's quipping with him, she's having fun with him. Like when she's asking him about like tell me something about you that no one would ever know, and he talks about how he can't eat toast if it's cut diagonally, and she's like, then he says like, wait a minute, that's not really a test, is it? And she's like, and she just kind of smiles. She's like, no, I just wanted to know what you would say.
yeah. I mean, you have to also think about it like here's a woman who woke up 6 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
remembers nothing about herself on an alien world, and now is under the belief that she's an alien, coming to the planet now discovering that she's
Mm-hmm.
not a Kree. She really is a human, and like trying to rediscover her own place in the world. So that's gonna keep you from because you've also she's been interacting with a group of shape shifting aliens that anybody could be anything at any time. So you have to be careful of who you're opening up to, and so I don't know. I thought she played it very well. When she was more wooden, like felt like it was necessary for that scene, and then
Exactly.
she had the wry smiles and a more of a dry sense of humor, which we don't tend to get. I guess we don't tend to get that out of female actors as much. So I think people misinterpreted that, and to get into the the real world aspect of it, because she was willing to stand up and say some things that were true.
Mhm.
The troll army wanted to attack her,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and try to take her down for daring to have an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I'll 100% co-sign all that. And one of the things I do wish too is maybe if they had played up the mystery angle, because I think there would have been, because one of the things that happens to Carol in the comics is after Rogue drains her powers and her memories, Professor X is able to restore her memories, but she has no emotional connection to them. So I think that aspect of her character, would have kind of been interesting to play with here if maybe she gets her memories back, but she can't feel that same emotional connection to them that she used to. And it would have been a cool way to play with the idea of memory and all that kind of stuff too. If, again, we might be spending too much time then on that kind of stuff, but I think that would also be something interesting way to play with that concept from the comics.
Yeah, and I will say I do appreciate this new wave of superhero movies where the first movie isn't necessarily a true origin movie anymore. Like we're skipping over the boring parts of the origin story and just trying to get into it. But with a character like Captain Marvel, who is familiar to people like you and I, but isn't familiar to your general audience, you kind of have to do some backstory to build it in. Like you can't in the world of Batman, you don't have to kill the parents anymore. You just don't. The next Batman movie, you don't have to. You can just skip over that and go right into it.
Right. I mean, they didn't even in the Batman. They didn't even they talk about it. They reference it, but they never go back, and we don't see the pearls falling in slow motion for the 50th time.
And that's what I loved about Homecoming. Because you don't deal with Uncle Ben again. Like you just start. He's already Spider-Man. We don't have to go over that again. We've seen it twice now. Maybe more if you include the animated shows and the '70s shows, and
Right.
But everybody knows Spider-Man. Everybody knows Batman. Everybody knows Superman. You can skip that.
Yes.
So when in a way with like Captain Marvel, you have to find a way to do sort of an origin, but get to the fun stuff and get to the good stuff right away. And that I think you're still stumbling with characters that aren't as well known. And I think there is a little bit of a stumble here, but I think for the most part they hit it well.
Yeah, I like that. I like what you said there too. I agree with you as well. Like a lot of the origin story stuff, for the longest time, all we got in superhero movies was the origin story because that's a very easy story for Hollywood producers to understand. It's the classic hero's journey story. So, the hero discovers, he gets these fantastic powers, ends up going through this journey, ends up putting on the costume in the third act. All of that totally makes sense in the hero's journey arc. But as you're doing more and more of these movies, it starts to become old hat, especially when you're doing multiple movies and building up this franchise, like having a new origin story every single time you have a new character. Audiences they're talking about superhero fatigue now. I think superhero fatigue would have set in a lot earlier if Marvel just kept doing origin stories.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where Black Panther really worked well, is that they introduced the character in Civil War.
Right.
So that when he got a solo movie, they didn't have to do as much, origin movie. They could pretty much just get right into it because you already know this character. We've shown him to you. You kind of have an idea of what he's about and who he is. So here he is already, and then maybe we'll just talk about it or do some flashbacks to the origin just to kind of give you some hints. But like we're good, we're golden. Like let's move on.
Yeah, and this I still think Incredible Hulk was one of my favorite ways they did the origin because they just had it in that montage in the opening credits, and that was all you needed to know about how Bruce Banner became the Hulk.
Right.
And here in this movie too, having it unfold like a mystery works very well. I mean, this is actually how I think they should have done X-Men Origins Wolverine. They should have had him waking up, no memory of who he is, and then trying to piece it together by going through and investigating it and treat it like an actual mystery. And even though I quibble a little bit about how well they handled that mystery aspect, I think they could have executed it better. I really like the attempt here, and I really like how they're trying to do the origin story in a different way. Because you're right, with a character like Captain Marvel, you have to find a way to tell that origin story, especially because in the comics, her origin is so tied to a completely different character. So
Right.
having to figure out how are we going to explain this to people, A, who are not familiar with this character, and B, who are familiar with her in a very different context. This is a really good way to do it. And I was actually surprised that they worked in Marvel at all. I was not expecting that.
Yeah. And, and I know a lot of people quibble when they change anything, but I'm okay with it because when I got back into comics, I got really into the Ultimate Universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I really came to appreciate the Ultimate Universe as well as I was reading the 616 stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you can have the different universes going on. So as long as we take 616 and put it aside and go, that's the books, that's just for reading. This is, I don't know what MCU's number is supposed to be. I know at some point I think they said it in Multiverse of Madness.
Multiverse of Madness said it was 616, but then I think What If said it was a different one. So I don't know. I don't think there's like official clarification on that.
But it basically it gives you the ability to tweak it, change it a little bit, as long as you stay close enough.
Right.
Which I feel like this did. Like it stayed close enough. Like it changed it a little bit to make it more sense. Plus, other characters have already kind of taken some of this origin, and they didn't have time to introduce 30 new characters on top of the one or two that they already were trying to introduce.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like I feel like when you're adapting these things, it can't always be a one-to-one translation. It just doesn't work. You're talking about two different mediums, one of which has 60 plus years of monthly stories that you have to sift through to try to make it all make sense. You can't cram all that into a 2-hour movie. You just can't. So you're going to have to make compromises and make changes here and there. And I'm fine with that. And I think my main thing is, and this is what I like about the MCU as opposed to, say, a lot of the Snyder films, was that they captured what I felt was like the essence of these characters. They stayed true to who these characters were at their core. And so, like, even though Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark isn't exactly like the Tony Stark in the comic books, he's got that same core of the character, right? Where he's this arrogant guy who feels like he's the smartest person in the room. Same thing with Chris Evans as Captain America, right? Chris Evans' version of Steve Rogers is just slightly askew of the comics version, but he managed to synthesize the core aspects of what that character is. And that's what I appreciate about what a lot of these movies are doing now. Or even some of the X-Men movies. I mean, right before this, we recorded the episode on X2. That movie is very divorced from the comics, but they get so much right about the core of what the X-Men are in that movie that I can live with the changes they make to the characters or to the backgrounds or anything like that.
Right, and I'm with you on those characters. I mean, I might be one of the only people on the planet who really love Taskmaster. He is one of my favorite characters. Mm-hmm. So that was the biggest annoyance to me so far in the MCU is what they did to Taskmaster in the Black Widow movie, because you can't go back and do it.
Mm-hmm.
I
agree with that. I'd also co-signed Ghost from Ant-Man and the Wasp. That was another disappointment for me because I love that character in the comics too.
I don't have as much. I knew there was a little different, or actually a lot different, but I didn't have a love for Ghost, so that one didn't bother me as much. But like I said, I'm probably one of the few people on the planet who are like Taskmaster. Oh, because most people are like, who's Taskmaster? Like,
right? Yeah, I mean, speaking of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I remember the chatter at the time was a lot of people thought. I'm blanking on his name now, but the guy who ends up being the double agent for Hydra. A lot of people were thinking at the time, maybe he's Taskmaster. It was kind of like the big theory, which would have been fun to see. I think that would have worked out better than what they did, but whatever. But yeah, I agree with you. I was a little bit disappointed in Taskmaster as well for that reason. And I think taking it back to Captain Marvel, this is an example where they they stay true to who that character is. This is who Carol Danvers is. There may be some differences in her origin story, right? Marvel is a woman now instead of a man, and he doesn't actually, or she doesn't actually don a superhero costume. All of that's fine because the core of who Carol is with that character.
Right. Yeah. I would say that the only thing, and I feel like based on the trailer that just came out for Secret Invasion, it's going to be fixed. And I wondered it at the time. The biggest complaint I had at the end of the movie, other was than just the Skrulls
Mm-hmm.
being the good guys. Like they've pretty much always been the bad guys.
So there's been a bit of back and forth on that. So one of the things I liked about this movie is that they didn't go with the straight good guys, bad guys, because they tried to show there was a lot more complexity in this. And I think we'll probably see this when we get to Secret Invasion and also maybe in the Marvels to a lesser extent. We might see some of it there. But this idea of my impression watching this movie was that it was Ben Mendelsohn and his group that were just refugees of this war. And
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean all the Skrulls are the good guys. It just means that maybe this one group is. So I think, and it'll be interesting to see how they play with that because they've done some stories in the comic books with different factions of Skrulls. There was a story they did in the X-Men books in the, I think it was the early 2000s, where there was a group of Skrulls that were actually mutant Skrulls and were actually being persecuted by the rest of the Skrulls, and they ended up becoming heroes, and Professor X ended up going out with them in space for a time. So they've had different factions of Skrulls throughout the Marvel comics, and that was one of the things that disappointed me about Secret Invasion was it felt like the comic book it felt like they had ignored all these other stories about the Skrulls that had happened since the 1970s.
I mean, and I know that the Skrull, I just keep trying to put
Pre-Skrull
those two
War,
words
yeah.
together. The Skrull Kree War has been raging from the beginning of when both of these groups were introduced into the comics in the first place, and who's the bad guy, who's the good guy. It's very fluid based on who's telling the story and what side you're looking at. But and there are not just like not every Kree is bad either. I mean, they just tend to be. Same thing with the Skrulls. Not every Skrull is bad. They just always tend to be.
Right.
But it was very jarring to see them like being portrayed solely as the good guys when like I know there's this history of mainly they are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do wonder with and obviously whatever the Secret Invasion show that we're getting on Disney Plus is going to be vastly different than the Secret Invasion book.
Mm-hmm.
I know they're leading up to Kang Dynasty and then Secret War, and I don't know what ultimately the game plan is with all of it. And I think I think there've been hints laid in the movies that we've seen, but we just don't know we've seen it yet.
Yeah. I think they're going to be playing around with that, and I'm looking forward to Secret Invasion. That trailer we got looks great. I'm glad we're going to finally get a chance to see Samuel L. Jackson play Nick Fury as a lead character. And I like how the idea of who is the good guy, who is the bad guy in a war, and also Carol as Veers in this part of her life, right? She's only experienced one side of things, right? She's been essentially brainwashed by the Kree into thinking like this is a fight of good versus evil, and then we have that all flipped on its head, and we find out that whole idea of one man's terrorist is other man's freedom fighter. I like that they're playing around with that idea of there are two sides in war. It's not always a black and white situation.
Yeah. And I do wonder if going into the Marvels movie that we're getting here in a couple months, or the Secret Invasion that we're getting, in a couple months as well, because as of yet, you don't have to have seen any of the Disney Plus movies to enjoy any of the Marvel movies.
Right.
So, like, seeing WandaVision before Multiverse of Madness helps, but not necessary. But I do wonder if going into Captain America, whatever, New World Order,
Yeah.
if you don't see, Falcon Winter Soldier first, and I do wonder, where that's going to put some of the movies, or even some of the shows when we get to the point of like, oh, you didn't watch it all. Well, now you're lost. And
Mhm.
I do wonder if at that point, if superhero fatigue isn't going to actually set in.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm wondering about that myself because someone like me, I'm all in on the MCU. I watch
Right.
everything when it comes out. Um, but other stuff like I still haven't. I've only seen the first episode of the new season of Mandalorian. I've only seen the first episode of Boba Fett. I still haven't watched all of that yet. I've only seen about half of Andor, so I'm like really behind on the Star Wars stuff. Um, and I do wonder when we get to that with the MCU, because I do know there are a lot of people who are not up to date on some stuff. Like I spoken to people, I'm like, oh yeah, She Hulk was amazing, and they're like, what's She Hulk? And I'm like, you haven't. And it blows me away because that's still
Yeah.
my favorite
Oh,
Disney Plus show.
I loved She-Hulk. I
Mhm.
love. Oh, that was so good. And I mean, Tatiana Maslany is just amazing.
God,
Like
yes,
Orphan Black was just mind-blowingly good.
I still have to see
Um,
that.
oh, if you can hunt it down, I highly recommend it. I actually want to rewatch it because they just did a podcast where they did like 2 seasons of a podcast where they actually had Tatiana Maslany come back and do voices,
Oh,
where it
cool.
was like I continue it like so they think they did it was basically like season 6 and 7 of the show.
Hmm. That's
So
interesting.
I wanna go back and rewatch the first five, um but my wife gave up on She Hulk like 2 or 3 episodes in. Like she was just like I'm good, I'm done. Like her
Yeah,
her tolerance for that kind of fourth wall breaking is not as high as mine, but
yeah. My
she
wife
wasn't raised
hasn't.
on.
My wife is still. She's still for the movies. Like she'll still watch the movies, but
Yes.
she's less interested in the TV shows. Like she'll pop in every now and then. I think she watched a few episodes of Ms. Marvel. She watched a few episodes of Moon Knight. Um, she watched all of WandaVision. I think she watched all of Loki and a few others, but other ones she's just kind of like, I'll pop in here. Maybe I'll get to it later at some point. But yeah, she's definitely much more invested in the movies as opposed to the TV shows. So it is going to be interesting to see. And we're in completely untested waters at this point, right? We're in now a point where if you haven't watched everything, are you going to be able to understand this? And it's a gamble Marvel's taking to see like how much they're going to be able to
Right.
make these accessible for people while still also having all this content out there.
Well, and that was something a few years ago they were talking about doing with Dark Tower.
Hmm.
When they were trying to do Dark Tower, they're like, all right, we're going to do a movie, and then we're going to do a season or two of a show, and then we'll go back to doing a movie, and then we'll do and that just people are like, that's never going to work. You're not going to
Hmm.
get you're going to have people watch the movie, then not watch the show, and then try to watch the second movie that you've now hinged on watching a couple seasons of a
Right.
show. And so that idea died. Well, Marvel apparently was like, I think we can make it work.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Because
I hope they do. I hope they do, or at least that they are able to make it work enough where they're able to keep doing this stuff. Because being a longtime comics book fan, like it's I love seeing all this interconnectivity, but also I know that horror that I get when I talk to people who are interested in comic books, or even just now, I'm teaching a class where I'm using comic books in the class, and I'm just like, shit, what comics can I give my students to read where they won't be lost? So it's definitely a challenge.
Well, my that was something that would come up when I talked to friends because I'd be buying like 20 or so different
Mhm.
titles a month or whatever it was, and like, well, how can you keep all of that straight? And it's like I just how I was raised. Like
Right.
the the books raised me that way. They taught my attention span to be able to focus on this book, then focus on that book, and then put the two together where I need to put them together in the appropriate timeline.
Hmm.
You know, and so they are trying to do with the movies and the TV shows what they've been doing with the books for 70 years.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
And it'll be interesting to see if it translates to a wider audience. Um, anyway, let's talk about some of more of the performances in here. So we talked a little bit about Brie Larson. I mean, Samuel L. Jackson is always great as Nick Fury, but I love that he had so much more to do in this movie than he's gotten up to date in the MCU.
I
And
agree.
and we get to see a different side of him, right? We get to see a bit of a more of a human side to him as opposed to always the cold badass we get in most of the movies.
Yeah, well, because he hasn't, whatever he's experienced between Captain Marvel and, Avengers,
Hmm.
or Iron Man. Iron Man 2 is when I guess he really shows up. Um, like whatever we haven't seen what he experienced there yet, so we don't
Yeah.
know what turned him bitter. You know, you
Yeah,
know.
but also
Uh,
just like to see that different side of him was just such a nice change of pace, and to kind of see like where he was, where he started off, where he will end up later on, where he becomes so bitter and cynical and untrustworthy.
right, exactly. I think it was amazing that they were able to pull out Annette Bening.
Hmm.
It was also interesting that you pulled out Annette Bening and then you barely used her.
Yeah, I mean, I loved her as Marvel. I kind of wish we'd. I'm kind of hoping we'd get like a Marvel series or something where we get to see more of Annette Bening playing that character.
Yeah, it seems like such a well. I guess Glenn Close in Guardians 1 or 2. I don't remember which
Guardians one,
one
yeah,
now. Guardians 1. It's like, wait, you spent the money to get an actor of that caliber for barely more than an extended cameo. Like, I mean, same thing with like Jude Law. Like, I mean, I really enjoyed. I thought Jude Law was. I mean, again, knowing the comics before helped me.
hmm
So when Jude Law ended up being the villain, you're like, oh, well, yeah, I wasn't surprised by that, but you know, his role, like you kind of pick up on it early. If you knew that the Kree were who they were.
hmm
But I think he played it well enough that, like, for the people who didn't know that, were genuinely like, when he had his heel turn, like, genuinely kind of shocked by it.
yeah. I agree. I thought Jude Law. If you had asked me what part would you want Jude Law to play in the MCU, I'm not sure what I would have said, but it definitely wouldn't have been Jan Rog. So it was. It's a surprising choice to have him in a role like this, but he does a good job. He does a really good job in it. I really enjoyed him in this movie. Also, it was great seeing Clark Gregg as a young Phil Coulson, and just like he's like just so green in this movie, and it makes sense why he's so cool in later movies and like nothing affects him because he saw all this shit in Captain Marvel.
Right, because they're calling him rookie, and
Mm,
so I mean, I don't know how many days onto the job he is, but he's still young enough that he's called a rookie, and he's being shot at by space cannons and having his identity stolen by aliens, and
yeah.
you know cats puking up cosmic rocks on it.
But I think maybe my favorite performance in this is probably Ben Mendelsohn as Talos. He he displays it in. It's funny because I saw him in The Outsider recently, which is a completely different type of role. So it's really funny to go back and watch him in this now, and just like how much fun he's having playing this character.
Yeah, I can't say I'm overly familiar with Ben Mendelsohn. I mean, I know him, like but I don't know where I can't place where I know him from other than this movie.
He was also in The Dark Knight Rises. He was the Daggett, the corporate guy.
Okay, yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's one of those, like, I'm sure if I was to go look at IMDb and glance through, I'd be like, oh, that's where I know him from. Oh, that's where I know him from. That's sometimes my encyclopedic memory of random actors playing random things fails me. But
mhm,
when you get to your mid 40s, it starts falling apart.
right. But I liked what he did here. I'm really looking forward to seeing him back in Secret Invasion. Also, I like the brief bit of him we get at the end of Spider-Man: No Way Home. We find out he's been impersonating Fury the whole time.
Yeah. Um, I do wonder, what do you have they said, or I'm guessing they'll get to it with Secret Invasion. Have you been able to figure out where the Talos Fury switch happened?
I don't think they've ever said it, but my guess is it happened after Endgame would be where I'd say it happened, because it makes sense
Okay.
that he was Fury the whole time in No Way Home, because I mean Fury in that movie, like he gets punked a lot by he gets run circles around quite a bit in that movie, so it makes sense that it's Talos impersonating Fury as opposed to Fury being in that movie until the end.
Yeah, and that little post credit scene did make that make more sense, because there was that, like, wait, Fury fell, like, repeatedly fell for this, like,
Mm-hmm.
and then it makes sense. Oh, okay. But I was just wondering, like, because I know some people are like, wait, does that mean Fury has been, Talos the entire time, even during Avengers? And I'm like, no, I think the switch happened some point after, either during or right, somewhere between Infinity War and Endgame or after Endgame.
I think it happened after
That
Endgame because he was dusted at the end of Infinity War. So it makes sense that after coming back from that, he's going to want to take space threats more seriously. So that's why he goes up into space, starts working with Talos. So that fits a lot better than I think.
Yeah. Because I'm guessing that's going to also lead to Sword being introduced.
Yeah, they were introduced in WandaVision. There was that organization
Okay.
that was going after it. They
Oh, that's
changed it because
right. Yeah.
it wasn't just space though. That was, instead of sentient world, it was sentient weapons
Okay.
observation.
Yeah.
So they'll probably
Yeah.
combine them together and create like the space-based sword in Secret Invasion is what seems to be what's happening.
Oh. I wonder. I'm curious. And I know this is getting off topic by quite a bit, but that's what I do on my show. So welcome to my world.
That's fine. We do it all the time here as well.
When they get around to finally introducing Norman Osborn in the Spider-Man universe, if Norman Osborn is able to take over Shield and rename it Hammer and do that, like the Dark Avengers and that whole that whole storyline, which could be really fascinating. And
They might be doing a different version of that because it seems like they're setting up the Contessa for that kind of Osborn-like role, Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character, because she's going to be running the Thunderbolts, it looks like, which is probably going to end up being like the Dark Avengers type of thing. So, which I think is actually a better way to do that as opposed to what I've got very mixed feelings on Dark Reign and what they did with Norman Osborn in that story. I felt like they were taking him. I felt like that kind of role didn't really suit that character. If it was someone more like Baron Zemo, I think it would have made a lot more sense. But for Osborn, it never really fit very well with me, even though I like some of the stuff they did in those books. And of course, that's a question of if they're even going to bring Norman Osborn in after they did, after they had the alternate universe one pop up in No Way Home. I'm curious to see what they're going to do with the Spider-Man stuff now after they'd set all that stuff up.
Yeah, I don't because I'm guessing because I mean we've talked about the X-Men a few times already, and they've sort of introduced the concept in Multiverse of Madness when they brought Professor X in. They finally said the word mutant with Miss Marvel.
They said a mutation with Ms. Marvel, but it was actually Namor in Wakanda Forever who says I'm a mutant. So he literally is Marvel's first mutant because he's the first character to call himself a mutant.
Right. I've always wondered. I was wondering if the blip would do it, but now I'm wondering if this multiverse war that's coming isn't going to. Because I do think that same problem that with the origin stories is that now you have to figure out a way to create the mutant problem.
Yeah.
I mean, for lack of a better word. Where you either have to say this entire group of people have been hanging out in Connecticut, ignoring everything, and now they're showing up and doing something, or you have to bring in an entire universe that's had the mutant thing, and now these two universes are sharing the same world.
Yeah, so I've got a theory of how that could work. People who listened to last week's episode, you're going to be hearing this again because we just talked about this at the end of the X2 episode. We literally just finished recording before this. And my guest, one of my guests who was on that one, Oscar Owens, he said that the multiverse thing makes more sense to him, especially when you bring in the whole mutant angle. So it makes sense for the X-Men to come in and mutants to come in from a different world. My way of thinking is I think they're setting it up with the blip. And because you see that in WandaVision, it's revealed that Wanda seemed to have some power before she came into contact with the Mind Stone. The Mind Stone just kind of like jump started it. And so I think what it was, and then also in Endgame, from Infinity War to Endgame, we had 3 different snaps, uses of all the Infinity Stones on Earth. And Rocket said when Thanos did the blip, it was this surge of cosmic energy that had never been seen before. And then we get those same surges twice more in Endgame. So my theory is that mutants have existed, like Namor has been around for a while now, but they've been in such small numbers. So you could have something like Krakoa, which is a sentient mutant island. It can move around from place to place. So my theory is that mutants have existed for years, but the numbers have been so small. You're talking like 1 in a million or something like that. And you've been able, Xavier and Magneto have been gathering up mutant refugees, living with them on Krakoa. But now with the blip, there's this surge of cosmic energy, and it's jump-started the X gene. So whereas a lot of people now, if their grandchildren or great-grandchildren were to become mutants, now instead they're happening. So the mutant gene is being activated several generations early, and there's this big explosion in the mutant population. I think that can work with what's been established in the MCU, and can also give people that fear of mutants because they came from what was the worst tragedy that humankind ever experienced.
That makes way more sense than anything I've really thought out, and
I think about this stuff way too much.
But yeah, I mean, because I would say, like, you know, with the coming of the mutants, because that's going to happen. We're going to get it. I mean, they have to figure out. They're making Deadpool 3, so they're going to have to figure out how to tie that in.
Right. And they're bringing in a multiversal Wolverine in that one too, because Hugh Jackman's coming back, but they said it's not going to be the same Wolverine from the X-Men movies. Also, we had Patrick Stewart playing Professor X, but again, wasn't the same Professor X from the X-Men movies.
Yeah, and you know, who knows? And that, you know, I know they introduced the idea of Reed Richards, and they keep saying they're doing a Fantastic Four movie. Who knows if it's actually going to be John Krasinski or any of the other 157 actors that have been officially listed as in final talks. I think I would love to see, same with they did with Black Panther. I would love to see the Fantastic Four introduced in a Spider-Man movie, or maybe even the idea of having them introduced in the Marvels. I mean, I doubt, because there's been no rumors that it'll probably be introduced that fast, but introduce them in that, so that when we get the Fantastic Four movie, we can go right into it. We don't have to do the origin again.
Yeah. And in fact, I think it's funny that they started off with, they did Captain Marvel in the past, because the Fantastic Four going on their space mission would have made a lot of sense in the past, and then like in like some sort of time warp or something, and then bringing back in the present. And maybe they'd had adventures out in space or something like that in that time period. I think something like that would have made a lot of sense for them. I mean, I will say my dream casting for Reed Richards is now out of the question, but I was hoping for William Jackson Harper from The Good Place. Someone had mentioned him as Reed Richards, and I thought that was a great choice. But then he popped up in Quantumania, so probably not going to happen now. Although Gemma Chan appeared in this as Minerva, and then she popped up as Cersei in Eternal, so you never know.
Right, you know, it wouldn't be the first time they've just recast an actor and used him a second time, or just straight up changed altogether. Who knows? It'll be interesting to see going forward. You know, and I like the idea of introducing a character in a movie so that we can kind of skip the origin and go right into something, you know, something else. Although that being said, like Shang-Chi was amazing, you know, that was just a straight origin. So, I mean, it can be done, and it can be done well.
Well, also, I think Shang-Chi did a lot with what Captain Marvel did as well, is they mix up the origin, so it's not all front loaded at the beginning of the movie, but it's peppered out throughout the movie. So you get these flashback scenes of him as a kid growing up, and it works very well that way. And I think that's a good way to do it, so that people don't, because I think that was a big problem with the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, is you had the origin stuff all front loaded at the beginning of the movie, and so much so that when you get to the Uncle Ben death scene, it just felt very by the numbers by the time you're watching Uncle Ben die. Whereas in Shang-Chi and Captain Marvel, the origin felt a lot more organically weaved into the overall story. But yeah, that's. Do we have anything else you want to say about Captain Marvel? Anything we haven't quite touched on that you wanted to? Oh, one thing we didn't talk about was Lashana Lynch as Maria Rambeau. What do you
Okay,
think of
yeah.
her and her relationship with Carol?
I would say that I don't. I'm not overly familiar with her character from the comic books to begin with. I know that Monica Rambeau becomes Photon or Captain Universe or whatever
So
they ended up.
yeah, Monica started off as Captain Marvel. She was actually the second Captain Marvel, and then um, when Marvel's son Janice came into the picture, she gave him the name back, and then she became Photon. Later on, she becomes what's that? She comes. There's another name she takes on for like a hot minute, and then she eventually becomes Spectrum in the Mighty Avengers books, and then I think
Yeah,
now
that
she's
that
back to Photon, if I'm not mistaken.
okay. I just it felt like, and maybe we'll get more of it. Well, probably not because we're so far into the future now, and that we've missed that entire relationship. That like they were supposedly like these great friends and super close,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that was one of the things that did feel a little disingenuous in the movie is that like you don't get the the buildup of them being friends. Like he just shows up and they're like, yeah, we're best friends again.
Mm-hmm.
you know yeah, you've been gone, we thought you were dead, you've been gone for 6 years. you know and then this woman is just like, oh, okay, we're great friends, all right, jump in the spaceship, let's go fight some aliens.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think that kind of touches on again this idea that I had of playing with the idea of giving Carol her memories, but not the emotional attachment to them, would have made for some interesting dynamics between the two of them. And also because when we see Monica in WandaVision, she seems a little bit, you know, bitter or angry towards Carol, and I feel like it's one thing to have it, well, she was gone this whole time. Yeah, again, I think but it'd make more sense if it's this idea that she has these memories, but she doesn't know how to connect to Monica anymore. Would have worked better because they seem to have a pretty good relationship when Carol leaves at the end of the movie here.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see with the Marvels because the trailer doesn't really show them really interacting very much. So
Right.
I don't know what the relationship is supposed to be, or where it stands. I'm sure there will be some, but you left for 20 years or however long it was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it'll be interesting. I'm definitely looking forward to doing it. Looking forward to it. Um, I'm sure the little girl's a little disappointed that they just jumped her character, that far into the future, so like she didn't get to continue on. But
Mm-hmm.
such is life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Same thing with the actress who played Cassie in the Ant-Man movies, right? She had the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, well, also probably the young T'Challa they introduced at the end of Wakanda Forever. He's probably going to be aged up in the multiverse stuff, I'd imagine.
I would assume, and that that allows them to bring T'Challa back in and
Mm-hmm.
call Black Panther T'Challa and
Right.
not.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's how they're going to recast T'Challa, by just calling him T'Challa Junior or
Yeah.
whatever.
Which is funny. They did
So
that with Nick Fury in the comic books to bring in a black Nick Fury so he looks like Samuel L. Jackson. They brought in Nick Fury Jr.
well, and they introduced Nick Fury as the African American gentleman in the Ultimate
Right.
Universe,
Yeah. But now he's
where
also in
they
616 too.
right, where they just totally patterned him after Samuel L. Jackson, and Samuel L. Jackson was like, that guy, I owe quite a bit of money to that guy because he gave me this entire career when he drew me as this character, and they were like, well, now we have to cast him.
Yeah, that was actually part of the deal because they went to Jackson and asked if they could use his likeness, and Jackson said yes if I get to play him in a movie. So they said yes, and then that's how they got to do it.
Oh, wish we could have seen David Hasselhoff play that. No, I'm not. I'm not mad about.
I've got a bit of a soft spot for I thought Hasselhoff did a surprisingly good job as Nick Fury in that movie. I mean, I suggest going back and watching it again. There's some stuff that's clunky about it, but I think Hasselhoff plays it surprisingly well for what you'd expect.
It has been. When did that movie? It was a TV movie in what, 98, 99?
97, 98, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably been since then since I've seen it. So yeah, I could watch it again.
We covered it on one of the very early episodes of this show. We covered it, so you can go back and listen to our conversation on that. And yeah, I mean, I thought Hasselhoff surprisingly was one of the better things about that movie. Sandra Hess's Viper, on the other hand, not so much. But I mean, personally, I think Kurt Russell is still who I would have loved to see play Nick Fury, especially back in the day. But
right.
that ship sailed now. Yeah, I think another disappointment is that we may never see. I loved the Captain Marvel series from the early 2000s that Peter David did, starring Marvel's son Genis. So that was my Captain Marvel, because that was the one I read when I was in high school. But I don't think we'll ever see him in the movies, which is kind of a disappointment to me.
Who knows? They've found ways to bring characters in and tie them in later in ways that I've been surprised by.
Well, I mean, yeah, the Shang-Chi thing, right? That's a good example of it. After I was really disappointed in Iron Man 3 and what they did to the Mandarin, and then when they did that, the All Hail the King one shot, and I'm like, oh, there's a real Mandarin out there. That's probably the last we'll ever hear of him. And then we get Tony Leung playing him and doing an amazing job of it. So
yes, yeah, and so there are. I trust Kevin Feige.
Yeah.
yeah. To do what Kevin Feige has done, like I don't know if there's been another, and obviously he's not doing it on his own, but to do a 20 plus 24, 25, whatever 26 movies they're up to now, and all the TV shows, and make them all interconnected and work, and very, very rarely ever contradict or force each other, force you to retcon a whole bunch of stuff. Like, they've made it work. And I would say, for the most part, have kept true to the comics and true to the vision of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and
Jack
all
Kirby,
of, Jack Kirby. That was the name I was trying to come up with, but
no,
all of the original.
I mean, what Feige and his team have been able to do is absolutely unprecedented. I mean, like, even Star Wars, Star Wars is the closest thing you have to a competitor, and they've had nowhere near the same amount of continuity of leadership or just sheer number of movies or TV shows. So,
right.
So yeah, it's definitely, and like we were saying, we're going to be in uncharted waters to see how they're able to keep threading this needle, where they're able to make it accessible for people who don't watch everything, but also make it packed enough so people who do watch everything feel like they're being rewarded for that.
Right.
But anyway, I think that's a pretty good note to end on. Anyway, Nicholas, can you tell people where they can find your stuff?
We are at mediapodsmash.com/popcultureroulette. I mean, that's our website, but it's easier just to find us at Pop Culture Roulette on Facebook. Or Pop Cult Roulette on Instagram, because they wouldn't let me have all of the letters.
I had that problem with my username too.
We try to put episodes out every Monday. We're pretty good about it. Like I said earlier, we try to stick to pop culture. One of the two guys that I do the podcast with is in superhero fatigue, so I've been trying to back down on always talking about Marvel or DC stuff and bringing in other stuff. But we just, the three of us, we've been friends now for a long time, and we enjoy watching TV and movies, and then talking about them and just bullshitting with each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. And we'll have links to that in the show notes so people can go and check that out. As for us, our website is superherocinephiles.com. Super Cinema Pod is the Twitter and Instagram handles. And if you subscribe to our Patreon page, then you get these episodes a week in advance. Plus, you get access to the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club once a month, where we talk about comic books, graphic novels, all that fun stuff. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. If you enjoy the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.